Julia closed her phone and felt her heart grow heavier. Her eldest daughter, Cassie, has just announced a meeting with a social worker. This time the conversation concerned a small child left without parents. The baby, who was currently in the children's center, needed a guardian, but due to financial problems at the center, he could quickly be transferred to another city if there was no suitable family. Julia was already 62, and it seemed that such questions no longer concerned her. But nevertheless, a strange feeling of warmth and slight anxiety arose in her heart. She remembered how, when she was young, she had already opened her home and heart to children who needed a family, but this time it was something special. Something inside her said that this child should stay by her side. Her house was quiet, except for the clock in the living room ticking softly, and the sun was slowly sinking behind a large tree in the yard. She already had 3 children, all adopted, but they had all grown up, and now there was a sad emptiness in Julia's house. It was as if the house was waiting for someone to come alive again. At that moment, her friend and neighbor, Miss Frances, knocked on the door. As always, Frances brought the pie for dinner and went up to the porch uninvited, knowing that Julia was always glad to see her.
"Oh, Julia, you have that thoughtful face again. What happened again?"
Frances, you won't believe it. I was contacted by the social service. They are looking for a guardian for the boy. He is only a few months old. Without parents, can you imagine?
Well, why did they come to you? No offense, but you're not 25 anymore. You've raised everyone. It's time to rest, isn't it?
I know, you're right. But it's a feeling. My whole life has been devoted to taking care of children, and I feel like I can help someone again.
Frances sighed and shook her head, adjusting her glasses as usual. She knew Julia like crazy, and had no doubt that her friend would do everything her own way, despite her doubts. "Frances, won't you get tired of torturing yourself? Big deal, 1 child. There are thousands of them, Julia. But you're looking at me, and I see that you've already decided everything, as always. Tell me honestly, you won't rest until you take this baby into the house, will you?"
I haven't decided yet. I just think this might be my chance to give someone happiness.
The next day, Julia, despite all her doubts, nevertheless contacted the social service. It turned out that the boy had recently turned 3 months old, and his name was James. She thought about this idea for a long time, but still decided. A few days later, late in the evening, a small social service van stopped at her house. A young woman in a neat coat, with a soft smile and deep dark eyes, appeared on the threshold. There was a baby wrapped in a blanket in her arms.
"Good evening, Mrs. Julia. Sorry for the late visit. We have brought your new son."
Julia nodded, feeling her heart pounding in her chest, and cautiously approached the woman. When she looked at the baby for the first time, she noticed how calmly he was sleeping. His small hands were folded on his chest, and his tiny lips were slightly parted. So tiny. What's his story?
His parents died in a car accident. The next of kin refused custody. He doesn't know anyone except the staff of our center.
Julia gently took James in her arms, and her heart fluttered with a feeling she hadn't felt in years. She felt a tiny body pressed against her chest, and instantly realized that now her life had meaning again. When the caseworker left, Julia entered the house, gently cradling James in her arms. She looked around her house, which had seemed too quiet and empty to her before, and suddenly realized how warm and cozy it would be here with the baby. She put him on a small cot, which she took out from the basement and prepared in advance. This moment was like a return to her youth, when she became a mother for the first time. Several months have passed, and Julia has got used to the new role. She was caring for the baby again, as she had once done many years ago. Her house came alive, filled with laughter and screams, and her days were filled with worries and worries. Over time, she began to notice that James was growing very fast, and his presence was becoming more and more important to her. The day came when James turned 1-year-old. Julia decided to arrange a small party, inviting her children and grandchildren. Cassie arrived with her husband and 2 children. Her middle son, Nate, arrived with his girlfriend, and the youngest daughter, Jennifer, brought gifts for James. There was already a cake on the table, and the house was filled with conversation and laughter.
"Mom, I see you're having fun babysitting the baby again, aren't you? I didn't think you'd make up your mind again."
Cassie, I didn't even imagine that I would do this again. But when I look at him, I realize that I needed him.
"Well, Mum, just don't take another one. We won't be able to keep up with you anymore."
And yet, it's like he chose you. You look happier than ever.
Julia laughed, feeling her heart swell with gratitude that her family supported her decision. But she knew there would be difficulties along the way, especially when James grew up and started asking questions. When James was 3 years old, Julia noticed the boy looking at other children and their parents on the playground. One day he approached her with a serious face and asked,
Mom, why don't I look like you?
Julia froze for a moment, but then she smiled and stroked his head.
Because you're special, James. You're my son, but you have your own story. When you're older, I'll tell it to you if you want to.
But are you my mom?
Yes, dear, and I always will be.
James nodded, hugging her, and that was all he needed to know. Julia realized that her love is stronger than any differences and questions. Over the years, her relationship with James has only grown stronger. He was her last son, her little miracle, whom she always protected. When he turned 5, he became her true friend, and their conversations became longer and deeper.
Mom, are you really glad I'm here?
Every day, son. You are the best thing that could have happened to me.
And even as time passed, Julia continued to feel the same way about him as she did the day she first picked him up. Now she knew for sure her life had found a new meaning. The years flew by like a flash. Julia never thought that old age would creep up so quickly, but suddenly she is already 70. She looked at herself in the mirror and noticed wrinkles, tired eyes and hands that were no longer as strong as before. But her heart remained alive and full of love. She still kept in touch with her children, but James held a special place in her life. When he was a child, they were bound by maternal love, but now, having grown up, he became her friend, her companion. After college, James decided to return home. He was determined to help Julia because he knew how difficult it was for her to manage alone. Now he was 25, tall, stately, with a deep and insightful nature. Julia couldn't help but notice how he had changed, becoming a strong and independent man. One day, returning home after work, James noticed Julia sitting on the veranda, lost in thought, with a thoughtful gaze directed into the distance. He came over, sat down next to her, and took her hand, smiling gently.
Mom, you look tired. Maybe you need to rest.
You know me. I'm always tired, but that's not the case at all. It's just life. She gets so weird sometimes.
Tell me. Maybe I can help.
What am I going to tell you, James? You're too young to understand such things. But I probably feel lost sometimes. You know, my children have grown up, everyone is busy with their lives, and you are the only one who stayed by my side.
James smiled and looked at her tenderly.
You will always be the main one for me. You know that's what I came back for, to be there for you and take care of you.
Julia sighed, feeling her heart fill with gratitude and some strange feeling that she did not even dare to describe. These years had brought them so close that sometimes she didn't know how to deal with her own emotions. As time passed, their days became routine, but there was something profound about this simplicity. James helped Julia around the house, cooked dinner for her. They walked in the park together, talked about everything in the world. Julia got used to this support and began to notice how she was looking at him. Those looks made her feel uncomfortable, but she couldn't help herself. One evening, while they were cooking dinner together, Julia suddenly froze, staring at James. He was washing vegetables, and she just stood there, watching his confident movements. At some point, he noticed her gaze.
Mom, you're looking at me like you want to say something. Is everything okay?
I'm sorry, James. I was just thinking. You've changed so much. When I look at you, it seems to me that you are already quite an adult. It's even strange.
Well, I am an adult. You're just used to seeing me as that boy. But that's okay.
Maybe. I'm just afraid that you'll leave like everyone else left.
James walked over to her and put his hand on her shoulder.
Mom, I'm not going anywhere. You and I are more than just a family. You are my support, my home. You will always be a part of my life.
This conversation touched her to the core. She understood that there was a special relationship between them that went beyond the usual maternal love. But no matter how much she wanted to realize it to the end, the fear of condemnation and separation was too great. She could feel a heavy feeling building up in her heart. In the following weeks, their bond only grew stronger. Julia realized that her dependence on James was beginning to worry her. She felt that she was becoming more and more attached to him, but she was afraid to admit it even to herself. The internal conflict was growing, and one evening she tried to discuss it with James. They were sitting in the living room when Julia plucked up the courage to look at him.
James, have you ever thought about leaving? Find your place.
What? Why are you asking this? I'm happy here with you. Yes, I had different opportunities, but I came back here on my own.
Sometimes I think, maybe you should move on, build your life. I'm afraid that you'll miss something important because of me.
James looked at her, serious and attentive.
Mom, do you think I regret my choice? Not at all. You've given me everything, and now it's my turn to take care of you.
But I don't want to be your burden. You're young, full of energy. You should have your own life.
You are my life. Do you understand that? I don't see the point in looking for something when I have something that is really important.
This conversation made her think about how deep their ties had already grown. But she couldn't afford to admit her feelings. Everything seemed so unreal to her, but at the same time inevitable. Late in the evening, Julia sat alone in the kitchen, deep in thought. She remembered all the moments when James was there, every time he supported her and smiled. At some point, she felt a heaviness in her chest, as if her feelings, which she had been hiding so carefully, had burst out. Suddenly, the door to the kitchen opened, and James stepped inside, stopping at the threshold. He looked worried, as if he knew that something incomprehensible was going on in her soul.
You're the only one here. Can't you sleep?
Yes, I was just thinking. You know, nights like this happen at our age.
Mom, I know you well enough to notice that something is bothering you.
Julia closed her eyes and took a deep breath.
Sometimes it seems to me that I have no right to demand so much from you. You need a life, James, not me.
You make it sound like I owe you, but I'm here of my own free will. This is my home, and you are my home.
Julia felt her heart begin to beat faster at every word James said. But she was afraid that her feelings had become so strong that her soul could no longer contain them. She tried to banish these thoughts, but every word, every look from James forced her to admit what she didn't want to admit.
James, I will always be grateful for everything you do, but please don't sacrifice yourself for me. I need you to be happy. Are you sure you know what makes me happy?
Those words were like a blow that knocked the ground out from under her feet at once. Julia lowered her eyes, feeling that they were on the verge. She was afraid to take a step forward, but it was already impossible to stay in place. From that day on, there was a feeling of incompleteness between them. They continued to communicate as always, but Julia noticed how often their gazes lingered on each other, how quickly they changed in the face when they are alone. There was something new and intense in the air. She didn't know how long she would be able to fight her feelings, but she was sure of one thing: their relationship would never be the same again. So keep the second point in full combat readiness, even deeper and stronger. Let me know if you want edits. I can add a spark. Julia and James' lives have settled into an established pattern, but only at first glance. Changes were taking place inside them, which one could not recognize, and the other could not fully realize. Every day their lives took on new shades where there was only care and support. Now there were moments filled with tension and an almost invisible, viscous attraction. Julia thought more and more often that her feelings for James had gone beyond the usual limits, but she drove these thoughts into the far corners of her mind, refusing to admit the obvious. James started every morning by taking care of Julia. He knew that it was already difficult for her to cope with daily chores. Her arms ached, her back often failed, and sometimes there was sadness in her eyes, which he could not ignore. James tried to fill her life with warmth and light, noticing her needs and joys. He seemed to be there at any moment, either bringing a cup of tea or preparing breakfast while she was relaxing on the veranda. The house, which had always been a symbol of comfort and peace for him, now became the place of their daily meetings, where every corner reminded of the little things they shared. Julia, although she felt gratitude and affection, could not get rid of the growing internal conflict. On the one hand, she saw James as a son, friend and protector, but on the other hand, she felt something deeper, which increasingly prevented her from being calmly with him. She found herself admiring his silhouette as he walked through the house, or how his face softly lit up by the light of the lamp when he was reading next to her. These little things created a new layer in their relationship, hidden from prying eyes, but frighteningly real for both of them. Sometimes when Julia was alone, she would sit by the window and reminisce. Images of the past flashed before her eyes, how she once took James in her arms for the first time, how he uttered his first word, how they overcame the difficulties of his growing up together. She remembered his childhood tears, his first steps, his loud laughter and carefree days. Now he had not been a child for a long time, and these memories remained only in her memory, which seemed to begin to contrast painfully with what she was feeling now. One day, when Julia felt particularly depressed, she realized that her fear of losing James was not just maternal anxiety. Her heart sank at the thought that he might leave, find himself another family, another home. She was afraid not because of loneliness, but because this house would have seemed empty without him, devoid of life. There was nothing left in her life but him, and in his presence she felt full and happy. James also noticed how Julia was getting dearer to him every day. He couldn't figure out what exactly attracted him to her wisdom, her ability to listen, or her endless care. He saw that she needed his support, and he wanted to be everything to her: a friend, a comfort, and even someone who would bring new dreams into her life. His attention to Julia became more and more caring and warm, but a strange feeling was growing inside him, which he could not yet find a name for. Every day their communication became deeper and more frank. At some moments Julia felt on a par with him, as if age and experience no longer mattered. He came to her with his thoughts and experiences. She shared her doubts and memories. James saw her not only as the eldest, but also as the only person with whom he could be completely honest. There were no innuendos in their conversations. Each knew that the other did not need to pretend. This intimacy was almost magical, fraught with something forbidden and charming that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. However, Julia couldn't hide her fear. She understood that such a relationship could lead to serious consequences, that society would not accept their closeness. She often replayed in her head what their relationship might look like from the outside, and she was terrified. It seemed to her that they would be condemned and James would be despised. These thoughts tormented her, poisoning the joy of their communication. But every time she tried to distance herself, something prevented her from doing so. It was as if her own heart resisted any attempt to break the bond. One warm summer morning, Julia decided that she needed to distract herself somehow. She took care of the garden, dipping her hands into the ground, feeling its cold roughness. This activity usually calmed her down, but today she couldn't get rid of the growing anxiety. Everything reminded her of James's help, his support, his warm gaze, which she caught on herself more and more often. He was everywhere, and it bothered her. As if in response to her thoughts, James appeared in the doorway. He noticed her tension and came over, trying to ease her condition somehow. His presence once again gave her the security she was looking for, but with it came the realization that without him her life would be empty. This realization gripped her with such force that she felt more dependent on him than ever before. She was afraid to admit it even to herself, but it was already impossible to ignore what was happening. So a few more months passed, and the tension between them continued to grow. Sometimes she caught his gaze, full of tenderness and longing, and realized that he could not remain indifferent either. They were both on the edge, afraid to cross a line that could destroy everything they had been building for so long. But every day they lived, every minute they spent together, connected them more and more, filling their hearts with something that could no longer be controlled. And so one evening, Julia realized that there was no point in hiding anymore. She could no longer hide behind the role of a mother, shut out her feelings. But to open up meant risking everything she valued so much. A difficult dilemma awaited her, either to fight with herself, staying in safe territory, or to allow herself to feel, despite the possible consequences. But one thing she knew for sure: this bond with James was something extraordinary, unique, and it was already impossible to break it. This was how their closeness, support, and connection grew, which only the two of them knew about, while society remained in the dark. But the secret tension was about to come out, and they both knew that at some point they would have to make a choice. A few more months passed, and the tension between Julia and James, lurking beneath the surface of their daily lives, became almost unbearable. Their every glance, every casual gesture only intensified this feeling, turning their communication into a game where both the rules and the consequences were unknown to them. Julia tried desperately to stay within the limits of her maternal role, but a spark was burning in her heart that she could no longer ignore. One such day, as Julia thoughtfully packed her things to go to town, she realized how much she was hurt by the thought that James might not return. She suddenly realized that her anxiety was caused not only by the fear of loneliness. Her feelings for James have long gone beyond the usual parental attachments. She needed him in a way that no one else had ever needed, and it awakened a deep-seated pain in her. Despite her efforts to hide her emotions, deep down she felt that she was no longer able to fight. She could no longer deny that James held a place in her heart that should not belong to an adopted son. Julia realized with pain that her affection for him had grown into something she would never want to admit, a feeling that destroyed boundaries and foundations, violating the rules of society and her own beliefs. Julia was immersed in the thought that such a feeling could change her life, forever destroying everything she had built over the years. But the harder she tried to suppress her emotions, the more exciting the feeling became. She began to see James not only as a man who supported her, but also as a man who could be her comfort, her peace and quiet. He was her rock, her friend, her only constant in this chaotic world. Trying to distract herself from her thoughts, she rushed into business, going into the garden, taking care of the house, trying to drive away painful thoughts from herself. However, her attempts to distract herself each time turned into an even greater realization that her feelings for James had penetrated into every corner of her soul. His voice, his laughter, his hands, all this caused indescribable sensations in her that she could no longer ignore. It was as if she was walking on the edge of a cliff, and every time she was drawn to take a step forward, towards the unknown. One evening, when Julia was alone again, it occurred to her that she had no right to feel this way. She tried to convince herself that this was just a temporary delusion, that everything would pass with time. But the more she analyzed her emotions, the more clearly she realized that her feelings for James were real and deep. She knew that she was on the threshold of a new, unknown path that could destroy her whole life, but her heart stubbornly refused to back down. These painful thoughts drove her to the point where she began to avoid James. She could no longer look into his eyes without fear that he would understand everything that was hidden behind her outer mask. She began to withdraw into herself, to leave him, trying to leave their communication on a superficial level. But every time he tried to comfort her, or was just there for her, her heart sank, and she felt like she couldn't hide behind that wall anymore. Julia was increasingly thinking that she needed to move away from James and perhaps leave him alone with his future life. She thought it was the right thing to do, that perhaps it was the only way to save herself and him from shame and pain. However, the thought of parting with him seemed unbearable to her. It was as if she was connected to him by invisible threads that could not be broken. She couldn't imagine her life without his warmth, his attention and care. Every day her attempts to resist became more and more painful. Julia increasingly felt that she was on the verge of having her feelings burst out. She tried to find the strength to suppress them, but her heart seemed to resist any order. At that moment she realized that her struggle was useless. These feelings were too strong to ignore. She began to realize that she might have to admit that her love for James had gone beyond what society considered acceptable. So she was trapped between her mind and her heart, between duty and passion. Julia felt that her life would never be the same, that her feelings for James had changed her forever. One day, when Julia was once again trying to distance herself from James, her inner conflict reached its limit. Trying to hide her feelings, she increasingly found an excuse to leave him alone, to avoid long evenings and confidential conversations that used to be part of their lives. It seemed that her heart was literally tearing apart, because the harder she tried to push James away, the more she suffered from it. She knew she was doomed. Her love for him had become a part of her, and no attempt to suppress it could bring relief. Her fear of the possible consequences of these feelings was so strong that she almost decided to take drastic measures to leave the city, leave James alone, and leave his life to give him the opportunity to build his own future. However, even the mere thought of being separated from him was a torment to her. She couldn't imagine how he would live without her, and even less imagined her life without him. Julia seemed to be standing on the edge, realizing that she had to make a choice between her mind and her heart. Meanwhile, James also began to feel that something had changed between them. He didn't understand what was going on, but every time Julia pushed him away, he felt a sharp pain, as if he was being rejected, not just as a son, but as something more. His thoughts became restless, and one day he decided that he had to clarify what was really going on. He realized that he couldn't live in ignorance without understanding what was going on with their relationship. His life and his affection for Julia were so strong that he was willing to risk everything to sort out his feelings and understand what Julia was hiding. When Julia realized that James had no intention of backing down and wanted to find out the truth, her fears intensified. She knew that it would not be easy to confess her feelings to him, because it would mean destroying all the moral norms that she was trying to observe. At that moment, Julia realized that she was on the verge of not only an emotional crisis, but also that now this connection, their closeness, would become the property of not only the two of them. She understood that if James found out about her feelings, it would affect not only their relationship, but also his life. Despair gripped her, her heart wanted intimacy with him, but her mind refused to accept such a choice. Their communication became strained and tense. James saw how Julia was suffering, but he couldn't understand the reasons, and it tore his soul apart. He saw her attempts to hide her emotions, but noticed how she often avoided his gaze, how her voice trembled with every conversation, how tears appeared in her eyes. This unbearable suspense drove him to despair, and he decided on the most important step in his life. He wanted to tell Julia about his feelings. When he finally confessed to her that his love for her was not just sons, but much deeper, Julia froze. All her fears, all her doubts, burst out at once. She realized that she couldn't hide anymore, couldn't deny that her heart had chosen James. But instead of relief, panic seized her. Now her feelings were not only her secret. Everything she had been hiding for so long had become reality, and now she had to make a decision that could ruin their lives. Julia felt crushed. She was aware that their feelings were mutual, but she also understood that society, their families, friends, everyone would condemn and not accept their connections. She imagined how James would become the object of ridicule, how he would be judged by others, how it would affect his future. She knew that his reputation, career and life could suffer because of her. These thoughts literally tore her soul apart, and Julia tried to find the strength to push him away, to convince him that this was just a delusion. Despite her attempts to convince herself and him that their love had no right to exist, James stayed by her side. His determination to be with her, despite all the difficulties, made her reconsider her views. She realized that for him it was not just emotions, that it was a real affection that would not be destroyed by the word no. But the fear for his future did not let her go, and Julia was in a state of constant internal conflict, not knowing what to do. She began to avoid all meetings with friends and relatives, trying to isolate herself from society so that her relationship with James would remain a secret. But deep down, Julia knew that this decision could not last forever, that one day they would have to go outside, and then the whole world would know about their feelings. These thoughts drove her to despair, but at the same time her love for James was so strong that she could not imagine life without him. She understood that it was impossible to go back. Julia could no longer hide her confusion and pain. Her heart and mind were torn between a sense of duty and true affection for James. She didn't know how to do the right thing, but every day her feelings only intensified. Her fears and doubts, her desire to save James from the condemnation of society, all this poisoned her soul, but even this could not extinguish her love. She understood that this choice would change their lives forever, but she could not accept it to the end. Every morning when she woke up, she felt pain, knowing that she had to push him away for his own good, but every day her resistance became weaker. Their confession had only increased the tension, and now she stood on the edge, knowing that any step forward or backward would be fateful for them. Every day Julia felt that her life was turning into a painful series of doubts and regrets. She woke up in the morning with an oppressive feeling of heaviness in her soul, as if her heart was slowly sinking into an abyss from which there was no return. Her love for James, so pure and sincere, turned into a curse for her, because now she was faced with a choice that scared her to the core. Her whole past, all the foundations on which her life was based, began to crumble. She understood that she could no longer exist in a world where social norms and the condemnation of others dictated to her who could be loved and who could not. Since the day they first confessed their feelings to each other, their bond has become even deeper and more complicated. Julia tried to find the strength to distance herself from James, but every step she took back led to a new surge of emotions that could not be controlled. She could sit by the window for hours remembering the moments she spent with him, his every look, gesture, touch. She realized that by rejecting him, she was denying herself happiness, but at the same time she could not ignore the fact that their love would be greeted by society as something immoral and wrong. As time passed, Julia became more and more immersed in her loneliness. She stopped seeing her friends, avoided family gatherings, trying to protect her secret from anyone who might reveal it. Julia knew that people always found something to condemn, and she was worried that their secret might come out, destroying everything she and James had built. Every evening she sat alone in her room for a long time, trying to find the answer to the question, would she be able to give up James for his own future? But despite her best efforts, her love for James was stronger than her fear. She knew that her heart would no longer be able to withstand life without him, that every day spent away from him would be a real torment for her. Julia felt that this attachment was beyond the control of time or reason, that she and James were connected by something so deep that no choice, no public condemnation could break this connection. Every morning when she saw James, her heart was filled with warmth and fear at the same time. She was afraid that one day their relationship would go beyond the mystery, that someone close or familiar would notice that there was more between them than the simple affection of an adopted son for his mother. Julia found herself thinking that she could not cope with this internal conflict, that her soul was torn between duty and sincere love, which she could no longer suppress. And then one day, when their internal conflict reached its peak, Julia made a decision that would change their lives forever. She realized that she could no longer hide behind the role of a mother. She could not close her heart from those feelings that had become a real test for her. Her decision was desperate and brave, but she knew that she could no longer live in constant fear and pain. She decided to open up, accept her love for James, and let it exist no matter what. Julia understood that this choice could cost her everything: her reputation, the respect of her children, communication with friends and family. But she also understood that this choice was the only way to be honest with herself and with James. She couldn't play the role anymore, couldn't turn a blind eye to the fact that her heart belonged to this man. Her love for him was above the fear of public opinion, above the fear of being rejected and condemned. After Julia realized that her decision was final, she felt a lightness she hadn't felt in a long time. Her torment, her fears, her despair, all this dissolved into the clarity of her choice. She realized that their love is stronger than any obstacles, that she and James will be able to cope with all difficulties if they are together. And even if the world turns away from them, they will have each other. And that will be enough. Julia couldn't sleep that night. She felt that every breath, every moment spent alone, brought her closer to what would become their new life. She knew that she would probably lose everyone she knew, but she also knew that she could no longer hide her feelings and live in fear. She was prepared for the fact that they would have a difficult path ahead, but her heart was full of determination and confidence that they would cope with all the trials together. Her decision was made, and from that moment on their lives changed forever. Julia no longer hid her feelings, and James, seeing her determination, also realized that their bond was now stronger than any norms and judgments. They began to build their lives based on their love, and although difficulties awaited them, every day together was a real happiness for them. Their story became a new chapter, full of trials, but also full of true love, which they were able to keep, no matter what. After Julia and James allowed their love to openly take a place in their lives, the most difficult stage began, full of internal and external clashes. At first glance, everything around them remained unchanged, but their life together acquired a new character. They became closer and more honest, but at the same time, every day required patience and perseverance from them. What used to be a secret that they could only keep to themselves now became open to those who were nearby, and soon it became impossible to hide this connection. The first to feel the changes was their immediate environment. Family, friends, neighbors, and even strangers who had previously seen them as mother and son began to notice the changed details of their communication. Rumors that might have seemed insignificant before began to circulate with renewed vigor, and soon there was no doubt that there was something more between Julia and James than the usual family ties. Julia knew it was inevitable, but she was still worried when her own children started asking her questions for the first time. Her children's reactions were painful and acute, as she expected. Cassie, her eldest daughter, initially refused to believe the rumors were true. She believed that Julia had simply become a victim of envious gossip and tried to convince her mother that this was just a misunderstanding. But over time, Cassie realized that the rumors were not just speculation, and her disappointment became resentment and anger. She felt betrayed, believing that her mother had violated all moral principles. Her brother and sister supported Cassie, and soon a split began in the family, destroying everything that Julia had been building for years. In relationships with children, with whom she shared everything throughout her life, became almost impossible. They demanded that she stop this relationship, threatened to break off the relationship, and even that they would no longer allow her to see her grandchildren. Julia was faced with a choice that tore her apart: to be with James, whom she loved more than anything in the world, or to submit to the demands of the children and return to a life where her feelings would be suppressed and hidden. She realized that her choice had brought pain to her loved ones, but at the same time she could not bring herself to turn away from James for the sake of other people's expectations. James saw how Julia was suffering, but he understood that their future was at stake and insisted that they remain true to their feelings. He knew that losing loved ones was painful for Julia, but he also knew that suppressing her true nature and feelings would break her. Together they decided that they would not allow themselves to be held hostage by the past and condemnation. Mutual support became their mainstay, although every day brought them new challenges. But the difficulties were not limited to the relationship with the family. Society as a whole turned out to be much more cruel and unforgiving than they could have imagined. Over time, their unusual relationship became known outside of their environment. Julia and James felt the intense attention from the public, and soon their situation became a topic of discussion in the city. People began to treat them with contempt, condemnation, and sometimes even outright hostility. Julia, always friendly and respected in her community, now had to deal with unfriendly looks and whispers behind her back. Gradually, despite her inner resilience, Julia began to realize that the pressure of society could be stronger than she expected. Their ordinary days became filled with a sense of anxiety when they went outside. They felt the coldness of others, whether in the store, on a walk, or at meetings with people who had once been their friends. For a long time they tried to ignore this tension, but over time it turned into a clear rejection. One day their house was covered with offensive words. Julia felt what a real shame it was to see her name and James's name turned into a laughingstock for everyone around her. It was the moment when she realized how vulnerable they were to the brutality of society, and that their lives would never be the same again. She felt that she had gone too far, but at the same time she could not imagine that she would be able to give up on James, knowing how strong their bond was. These events led them to decide to leave the city. They realized that staying surrounded by those who hate them for their love no longer makes sense. Julia and James packed up and went to a place where no one knew them, where their past could only remain their secret. This move was the beginning of a new chapter for them, filled with hope that far from condemnation and cruel looks, they would be able to rebuild their lives. However, even away from everyone, they still couldn't get rid of their inner feelings of guilt and anxiety. Julia sometimes found herself thinking that society affected their feelings so much that they felt like strangers, even in a new place. Time passed, and despite all the hardships, their bond grew stronger. They had learned to live with the understanding that their love was something that would always be on the verge of acceptance and condemnation, but now they didn't have to hide anything. In this new place, they were finally able to afford to be honest and open, knowing that their surroundings would not condemn or reject them for their feelings. It brought them the peace they craved. In their new home, surrounded by people who didn't know their past, Julia and James found the world they dreamed of. Their lives had become quieter and calmer. They enjoyed every moment together, without fear or shame, building their future away from cruelty and condemnation. They had learned to appreciate the simplicity and peace they had created themselves, and now they could see that their love had passed the test of time and obstacles. Eventually, Julia and James realized that their story, full of pain and hardship, had become a test for them, which made their bond truly indissoluble. Julia stopped halfway to her house. A light wind ruffled her old coat, as if urging her to walk away. She stood for a long time on the road, in front of the entrance gate, feeling that even the threshold of her own house had become a stranger to her. Her thoughts were occupied only with James, his voice, his eyes, which were increasingly searching for her, as if trying to penetrate to the very depths of her heart. She understood that staying at home meant submitting to these feelings. It was not the kind of love that is born from maternal affection, but something deeper, disturbing, and at the same time frighteningly beautiful. The next morning, Julia made a decision. She went to the train station to buy a ticket to the city where she once spent her youth. She needed solitude and an attempt to find peace where no one knew her. She almost felt relieved as the train carried her away, leaving behind a house filled with memories and feelings she was running from. The city greeted her with a cold rain. Julia walked through the wet streets, briefly remembering how a simple, quiet life had once lived here. It seemed to her that everything seemed so unchanged here: old houses, dark storefronts of closed shops, creaking benches under streetlights. She stopped at the entrance of a small hotel, went inside and asked for the simplest room. Her room was modestly cozy: a small table with a white napkin, a single lamp and a window overlooking a busy street. She stood at the window, watching the passers-by hurry home. Julia closed her eyes and allowed herself to cry for the first time in months. She was tormented by thoughts of James, his presence, which she now missed, his voice, which she hoped to forget. But memory was like a river that carries images, and with each new day she realized that her escape only makes her love stronger. A few days have passed. Julia tried to distract herself by walking through parks and narrow streets, but loneliness made her heart even heavier. One evening, walking into a small bar on the corner of the street, she accidentally heard a familiar voice. It was James. He was sitting at the counter, his gaze focused on a glass of water, and his face betrayed concern and bitterness. Julia froze, feeling her heart clench with fear and joy at the same time. She didn't know what to do: approach him or stay in the shadows. She slowly sat down at the next table, but couldn't stand it and took a deep breath, attracting his attention.
Mom.
His voice faltered when he saw her.
Do you think I'll just let you go, even if you go to the end of the world?
James, how did you find me?
She could barely utter these words, barely holding back tears.
Do you think you can disappear from my life without explanation? I've been looking for you and I'm not going to let you go. I miss you, Mom. You know I don't need anyone but you.
His words, so simple but heartfelt, made her tremble. She felt that he had come here for a reason, that he was looking for her, as if feeling her pain. However, she knew that these words only increased her anguish.
James, understand, I need this distance. You shouldn't have come here. You have to build your life. You have the whole future ahead of you, and I.
The whole future? What is the future? I want you to be there for me. Understand, I can't find a place for myself. I've tried to live without you, but it's impossible. You're all I have.
Julia noticed how his eyes turned dark with inner pain. He really wasn't going to back down. His love, his affection, was as strong as her own feelings. She knew that the longer they were together, the harder it would be to break their bond.
James, I understand that it's hard for you. But sometimes the best way to be with someone you love is to give them freedom. You can't depend on me all your life.
You sound like you don't feel the same way. Am I wrong, Mom? Aren't you running away from your feelings?
These words took her by surprise. He knew. He had guessed for a long time, and now all she had to do was either deny it or admit it. A storm of emotions flared up inside her, and her voice trembled.
Yes, James. I'm afraid of these feelings. I'm afraid we're violating something sacred. Understand, it's not easy for me. I'm leaving to save both of us.
You're leaving to escape the truth that we both know. You are my family, my only close person, and nothing can change that. If you need time, I'm willing to wait, but don't ask me to pretend that we're strangers.
Julia couldn't stand it. Her hand went to his face. Her fingers gently slid over his cheek, and she saw the sadness mixed with hope reflected in his eyes. They stared at each other for a long time without saying a word. Everything she was trying to hide stood between them like an invisible wall. But at that moment she realized that she could no longer deny what had already become a part of her life. Suddenly the door of the bar flew open, and a cold wind swept through the room, as if diluting the tension between them. Julia quickly took her hand away, and they both seemed to wake up from an obsession.
I will stay in this city, Mom. No matter how much you leave, I'll be there for you. I can't help it.
He left her at a loss, feeling that nothing depended on him now. She watched him leave the bar, leaving her alone, but something inside her told her that their bond was now impossible to break. A few days have passed. Julia decided to try to come to terms with herself and invited James to meet in an old park on the outskirts of the city. The park, overgrown and secluded, had been familiar to her since her youth. She found a place on an old wooden bench and anxiously awaited his arrival. James appeared in silence, but his look indicated that he was ready to listen to her. They sat side by side for a long time, not daring to start a conversation, but finally Julia spoke.
You're probably right. Maybe I should have been honest. I'm not afraid of what people will think, but that it will destroy everything we have.
We have love, Mom. And I'm willing to go through anything if it means being with you. Understand, I'm not asking anything from you except honesty.
Love. Do you really think that's possible? That we can just live by pretending that nothing out of the ordinary is happening?
I don't know, Mom. But I want to be there. I am ready for this, even if the whole world is against us.
Her heart skipped a beat, and at that moment she realized that maybe she should try too. She hugged him, and they stood like that, among the trees, while evening slowly fell around them. Julia realized that this path would not be easy, but now they both knew that they were ready to walk it together. James discreetly closed the door of the old library behind him when it was already getting dark outside the window. Here, among ancient, almost forgotten books and the musty smell of old paper, he felt himself in a world far from all his worries and torments. But no matter how much he wandered between the bookshelves, he did not find answers to his questions. Picking up a random volume from the table, he opened it in the middle and saw poems about love and separation. They seemed to be read aloud by the very air, making his heart ache at the thought of Julia. The pain that followed him everywhere soon led him to a desperate decision. He needed clarity, but he knew he couldn't find it here, among the dusty lines and pages. He needed not only confidence, but also determination. James took his things and went out into the cold evening air. He knew where he needed to go to finally put everything in its place. A few hours passed, and James, gathering his thoughts, decided to go to the house of their old acquaintance Molly, a woman with piercing eyes and a shrewd mind, who had always been something of an old friend to Julia. He was embarrassed that he was disturbing her peace at such a late hour, but it was already impossible to tolerate his doubts. Molly lived in an old house by the lake, surrounded by sprawling trees. After climbing up the narrow path to her house, James knocked on the door. After a minute, surprised but welcoming, she opened the door and invited him inside.
James, something happened? You look so pale, like you've seen a ghost.
Molly, I need your help. I feel like my life is ruined because of feelings I can't handle. You understand Julia better than anyone else, don't you? Perhaps you can understand me too.
Molly looked him over carefully, as if trying to discern something beneath the surface of his torment that he himself had not yet realized. She invited him to come into the living room and, offering tea, sat down opposite.
What's bothering you so much, Julia, right?
Yes, it is. She left trying to give me freedom, but all I feel is emptiness. Every day seems meaningless to me without her voice, her presence next to me.
Molly sipped her tea quietly, her eyes staring off into the distance, as if she understood this feeling much better than she would like to admit.
You know, James, your feelings are not as strange as you think. I have witnessed your connection for many years. It is stronger than simple maternal love, and this is obvious. But be careful. What you are feeling now may seem like illusory happiness, but it can become your pain.
I understand, but how can I betray myself, Molly? How can I deny my feelings? For me, the whole world revolves around Julia, and no norms, no rules can change what is happening inside me.
If you really feel so strongly, then it's not just love for you anymore, but maybe fate. But think about Julia. Her heart is breaking. She is afraid that your connection will destroy what she has been building for many years. If you really love her, maybe you should try to understand her worries.
Molly's words made James think. He got up and walked around the room, looking at the old photographs hanging on the walls, remembering how his life had always been connected with Julia in one way or another. But he also knew that he couldn't back down. That was the whole point of his decision.
Molly, I do not know what to do. On the one hand, I can't back down. I know it would be a betrayal for me and for her. But on the other hand, I can see how hard it is for her. She is tormented by the fact that her feelings for her son are not what they should be. How can I convince her that our feelings are real?
Molly paused, as if weighing her answer, and finally nodded, as if deciding that his doubts deserved the truth.
Go to her, James. Sometimes the only way to find out the truth is not to back down. Maybe Julia is waiting for you to prove your loyalty. You have to show that these are not just feelings, that you are ready to make a choice, no matter how difficult it may be.
Listening to her, James felt his calm return. He knew that the upcoming conversation could be a test for him, but his decision was firm. He would no longer hide from his feelings and let Julia see the truth, whatever it was. Early in the morning, under the soft sound of the surf, James drove up to Julia's old house. It was quiet and peaceful all around. The trees rustled softly, as if they were guarding her peace. Julia had already returned from her seclusion, but as soon as she opened the door and saw him, her face reflected a mixture of surprise and alarm. She silently invited him in, and he felt the tension between them become almost palpable.
You came. How did you find me?
It doesn't matter, Mom. I came to talk to you. I couldn't go on living without knowing how I really felt. I've been thinking about us, and I know it's not just a temporary feeling. It's something much bigger.
She looked away, as if distancing herself from his words, but he noticed that her hands were shaking slightly.
James, I was trying to give you freedom so that you could find your place. You should be building your life, not tearing it apart because of me.
Mom, you don't understand. For me, there is no life without you. I tried to imagine the future, but it seems empty without your presence. I don't just want to be with you, I'm willing to do anything to prove it to you.
Her eyes filled with tears, and she sighed, as if torn between her heart and her mind.
You don't understand what you're saying. This path can bring us a lot of pain, James. People will never accept how you feel, they will judge us. I'm afraid for you, for how this will affect your life.
I don't care what people think. This is my life, and only I can decide who I want to be with. I beg you, Mom, let me choose my own path.
She looked at him as if rediscovering him for herself. His determination and sincerity touched her heart, and although fear and pain were with her, she began to see that his love was real and could not be explained.
I do not know, James. I need time. I'm not sure I can accept it. For me, it's not just feelings, it's like a whirlwind that takes me somewhere where I can't stay the same.
Take any time, Mom, but know that I will not back down. I cannot. My love for you is greater than anything in the world, and it will not disappear no matter how much time passes. Even if we have to go through condemnation and pain, I'm ready if you're around.
These words shattered all her doubts, leaving her with a choice she had been avoiding for years. Julia closed her eyes, as if succumbing to this feeling, and after a moment, she reached out and touched his face.
You've been with me all this time, and I've always been afraid that one day you'd leave. But if you're really ready, I won't be able to reject you.
At that moment, there was not only understanding between them, but also a promise. The promise they made to each other in silence, preparing to walk the path that would change their lives forever. Now there was no place for fear and doubt in their world. On a night shrouded in thick fog, Julia realized that her decision to stay with James might have been hasty. Although her heart cried out to him and longed for his presence, logic and fear put pressure on her. Her inner conflict was growing, and no matter how hard she tried to get used to this feeling, it became more and more suffocating. Every new day spent with him filled her with bittersweet happiness, but as soon as she was alone, all her doubts flared up with renewed vigor, giving her no peace. The morning came when Julia, feeling exhausted from the constant internal struggle, decided that she had to leave again. She couldn't bring herself to tell James the truth. She was afraid that if she explained her feelings and doubts again, their relationship would turn into an endless toss between hope and fear. Therefore, before dawn, while the house was still dozing in the early morning silence, she packed her bag and left a short note on the table and left. At first, she just walked, enjoying the rare feeling of peace that came after she made a decision. Her footsteps echoed in the cool morning air, and the city, which had not yet woken up, seemed to her like something magical, as if transported to a world where time had stopped. By dawn, she was already on the bus, which took her many kilometers away from home, from James, from everything that connected her with that life in which every moment became unbearable torture. Julia was heading to a small town near the mountains, where her old friend once lived. She hoped that there she could find at least a temporary refuge from her thoughts and calm her heart. But her escape, as she soon realized, did not solve anything. She spent several days in this tiny town, wandering through the woods, listening to the silence, hoping that nature and loneliness would give her peace. But as soon as she closed her eyes, memories began to haunt her: his look, his smile, everything that made her heart beat faster. She tried to imagine her life without him, but instead of relief, she felt an emptiness engulf her. It's been a few weeks. Julia decided to settle in a small hut on the outskirts of the forest, away from the noise of the city and casual meetings. Her days turned into lonely rituals: morning walks, conversations with the forest, sunsets watched from a hill where she felt part of nature. But not a single activity, not a single thought could restore her sense of wholeness. Her inner self seemed to have ruptured, leaving her with an empty, painful feeling. But one night, when a strong wind swept through the forest and thunder tore through the sky, a new wave of panic swept over her. She suddenly realized that by leaving James, she had betrayed him and her feelings. This realization was like a blow that pierced her to the depths of her soul. She realized that her love for him was something she would never be able to get away from, that she would not be able to stifle this affection with any distance and external peace. When she returned to the city, she began to relive everything that connected her with James. Every memory of his warmth, of his words, of his support and love burned through her heart. She realized that even if they couldn't be together, being with him was her destiny, that being with him was something beyond her strength and fears. However, when she arrived at their house, she saw that the door was open and silence reigned inside. James didn't meet her, and that silence made her heart sink. She realized that her action could hurt him, that he might never forgive her for running away like that. But she was willing to accept his anger, his disappointment, just to see him again and understand that there really was something special between them. It was several hours before James returned home. He hadn't expected to see her, and when their gazes met, there were so many emotions reflected in his eyes: pain, joy, bitterness, and something else that she couldn't identify. They stood in silence for a long time until they realized that words would not help. Their connection, their story, it was not just love, it was a deep, inexplicable unity of souls. They could be silent, but they understood each other, as if their hearts were speaking for them. From that moment on, their relationship took on a new meaning. They began to realize that they could no longer hide behind formal words and roles. For the first time, they felt real, naked in front of each other, and this feeling did not frighten them, but on the contrary, brought a strange feeling of relief. Julia knew that their relationship had crossed all the boundaries of the usual, and now she could no longer deny that her love for James had nothing to do with maternal affection. She loved him as a man, as a friend, as her closest person, and this love was as natural as her breathing. Their lives had changed in every movement, in every look, even in silence. Their passion, their affection, their unconditional acceptance of each other was visible. Julia understood that she could no longer fight her feelings, that her flight was useless, because love would always remain with her, as a part of herself. But although their lives had found a strange balance, she was plagued by new fears. She understood that society would not accept their love, that their relationship would be condemned. She imagined how others would turn away from them, how their loved ones would not be able to understand what they shared. This fear tormented her like a nightmare, and she knew that their future would not be so simple. In an attempt to gain confidence, they began to change the situation, as if trying to find a place where no one would judge them. Julia and James moved to a small town on the coast, where no one knew them, and where they could just be themselves without explaining their feelings to anyone. Their house by the sea became a refuge for them, where they could enjoy each other without thinking about looks and judgments. However, as time passed, they realized that they could not hide forever. Their love became the meaning of life for them, but this secrecy turned into a heavy burden. Julia began to notice how her anxiety reflected on James, how his joy faded every time they were forced to pretend in front of neighbors, in front of acquaintances. She felt that this double life was depriving them of the happiness they deserved, and understood that hiding forever meant not living life fully. The realization of their love as a force beyond limitations and norms brought Julia and James a sense of inner freedom, but soon it was replaced by something more disturbing. At first, their days seemed filled with light and harmony. They found joy in simple things, whether it was walking by the sea together or reading books by lamplight when the world around them was quiet. Their life in their new place was measured and secluded, as if they existed in a separate universe independent of views and condemnation. But this illusion of security was fragile, and every day Julia felt more and more shaky. Their secret, their love, was something precious, but that was also their vulnerability. Julia began to realize that the fear of being exposed was growing in her heart like a heavy burden. She could no longer enjoy their happy solitude so calmly. On the contrary, every glance from an outsider, every whisper behind her back seemed to her a threat. This caused her to distance herself more and more, which caused James to worry as well. She began to avoid public places, doing everything to reduce the likelihood of revealing their relationship, even if it meant isolation. But the more she longed for peace, the more she realized that fear had become an integral part of her life. Admitting her feelings for James was such a decisive step that she did not immediately realize how deeply she would be hurt by the thought of the consequences. She couldn't sleep at night, imagining rage and condemnation raining down on both of them. Images of friends and relatives who had turned away from them, not understanding the depth or purity of their connection, were drawn in her head. She was tormented by the thought that her children, learning about her relationship with James, would not want to see her anymore, that she would lose their trust forever. This feeling suffocated her, turning every new day into an attempt to maintain a balance between love and fear. One day, unable to stand the tension, she decided to leave. Her plan was simple: to leave James, disappear, start all over again with a clean slate. She thought that she would do this for his own good, that her departure would free him from the unbearable burden that this love imposed on both of them. But standing on the threshold, with a suitcase in her hand, she realized that this step would destroy her soul completely. She couldn't leave. Her heart and mind were trapped in this love, which, although it brought pain, was the only real happiness for her. These weeks turned out to be one of the most difficult trials for Julia. The internal conflict became more and more painful, and every new day she forced herself to smile, to try to be strong for James. But her fear of society, of the possible consequences, of the destruction of everything she knew, corroded her from the inside. She understood that it was impossible to hide any longer, and that she and James would have to accept all the pain that this confession would bring to the world. One rainy evening, when Julia was alone with her thoughts again, a man appeared on her doorstep whom she did not expect to see in any way. It was her daughter Cassie. Soaked from the rain, with a tense expression on her face, Cassie stood in front of her mother, and Julia immediately realized that her secret was no longer hidden. How exactly her daughter found out about what existed between her and James, she did not know, but her own reflection in her daughter's eyes made her shrink inwardly. Meeting Cassie was excruciating. Her daughter, a strong, independent woman, could not understand and accept what her mother was hiding. Cassie was a mixture of anger, frustration, and a sense of betrayal. At first, Julia tried to justify herself, to find words that could explain her actions, but she quickly realized that no words could convey the true depth of her feelings. She knew it was impossible to explain her love for James, a feeling that was above social norms, could not be understood by those who looked at her from the outside. Talking to Cassie changed Julia. She realized that she couldn't run anymore. Now her children, friends, everyone she knew will know her secret. But there was also a strange freedom in this understanding, the realization that she no longer needed to pretend. In the evening she told James about what had happened, and in their eyes lit up the understanding that they were facing a choice on which their future depended. Julia and James decided to accept their fate, whatever it was. They realized that they could lose everything, their environment would turn away from them, their relationship would be condemned and cursed. But they also understood that to give up this love is to give up yourself. Julia finally let go of her fears and accepted it as part of their journey, which was inextricably linked to pain and rejection of social norms. And although every day brought new difficulties, their bond remained unbreakable, as if the world itself was powerless to break their unity. Time passed, and rumors about Julia and James spread in their circle. Friends, family, colleagues, each of them faced a choice: support them or reject them. Most turned away, and even those who had been close to Julia for many years could not accept her decision. She had lost her reputation, her respect, but despite this, her heart was no longer tormented by doubts. With each passing day, her life with James became a challenge. They remained alone against the whole world, like exiles, but in this solitude they found solace and strength. Their love has become for them not just a feeling, but a vow that cannot be broken, even if it means being left without the support of loved ones. One day Julia realized that her relationship with James had grown into something more than love. It had become their choice, their only true refuge. They decided to start from scratch, leaving behind those who could not accept them. Julia and James moved to another country to start a new life where no one knew their past. In this new world, they found the peace and quiet they craved. Now they could be together without fear, and although their journey was long and difficult, they knew that, despite everything, they had found their place where their love could be free. After Julia and James finally accepted their love, despite the difficult circumstances, their life turned into a test. They realized that every minute they spent together would now be under the gaze of those around them, those who could not understand or forgive their unusual union. Their small world, which they had so carefully guarded, turned out to be fragile and unprotected from the pressure of public condemnation. At first, their lives continued in relative silence. They settled in a small, secluded town where it seemed they could start all over again. However, rumors spread quickly, and soon curious neighbors appeared on their doorstep, trying under the guise of friendliness to understand what really connects these two. Glances, whispers behind their backs, biased attitudes, all this has become a part of their daily lives. Julia saw James struggling to keep their fragile peace and ignore the attacks of others, but over time the tension began to build up. Over time they began to avoid not only communication with neighbors, but also simple things that used to bring them joy. Going to the store, walking through the streets, all this turned into complex maneuvers, so as not to attract attention. They tried to seem like an ordinary couple with nothing to hide, but they managed it with difficulty. Julia became more and more withdrawn, feeling that she could not bear the weight of their secret. But she couldn't leave James and go back to her old life, and this internal contradiction made her even more vulnerable. Soon their lives began to be filled not only with alienation, but also with outright hostility. Their house was covered with insulting words, someone threw stones at the window, and they realized that staying here was no longer unbearable. James offered to leave everything behind, but Julia felt she couldn't run away again. However, one day when they returned home and found their garden trashed, she realized that the world around her would not change. Their choice will be condemned, their lives will remain at risk. They began to look for a way to leave, to find a place again where they could hide from hatred and dislike, but the question that faced them was not only where to settle. Now they were faced with the question of how to live on without destroying each other. Julia began to feel that their secrecy had become an unbearable ordeal for their bond. She saw how James was changing. He became withdrawn, distant, and his smile, which used to light up their world, disappeared. The decision came unexpectedly. They decided to go abroad, to a country where no one knew them. This step seemed desperate to them, but the only possible one. They realized that if they stayed, their love would be destroyed by pressure that they couldn't handle. They chose a place where no one knew their history, did not know about themselves. A country where they could not become victims of someone's prejudices. They chose the coast, where the ocean met the sky, and where they could start life anew, leaving behind all fears and doubts. After a long journey that seemed to them not only a physical displacement, but also a liberation from their past, they finally reached a new place. It was a small house on a hill, surrounded by greenery and covered with vines. The sea stretched out in the distance, and every day, watching the waves, Julia and James felt the weight that they had carried for so long fall from their souls. Here they could be themselves without looking back at other people's gazes, without thinking that someone was watching their every move. The first weeks passed in a blur. They enjoyed the silence, forgetting what it means to be afraid. They were finally able to live fully in this new home, and every moment they spent together reminded them of what they had gone through all the trials for. Their house was filled with light and laughter, their love became calm like the flow of a river, and they enjoyed this peace, as if their whole life was just a prelude to this moment. Julia found something to do that filled her life with meaning. She took care of the garden around the house, planted flowers and trees that made their secluded world even more beautiful. She immersed herself in her work, and her every day was filled with joy from simple things, from the scent of flowers, from the sound of the wind, from the warmth of the sun's rays. James found inspiration in painting. He began to paint paintings filled with bright colors and deep shades that reflected their complex but beautiful path. These paintings became their personal story, their memory of every day they lived together. However, even in this paradise, their past sometimes reminded them of itself. Julia sometimes found herself expecting to see familiar faces in the distance, or that someone would knock on the door, bringing with them rumors and condemnation. These moments brought her back to their long-standing pain, to the fear of losing James, and each time she felt her heart skip a beat at the thought that their happiness might be disrupted. But seeing how calmly and confidently James continued to live next to her, she found the strength to forget about it. Over time, their lives began to take on a new, deep meaning. Julia realized that their love had become something more than just a connection between two people. They have been through all the trials, but this struggle has made them stronger. They became not just partners for each other, but also support, a source of inspiration. They became one. Their house on the hill became for them not just a refuge, but a place where they could feel free and protected. Time passed, and their lives were filled with amazing moments, walks along the shore together, endless conversations under the stars, long winter evenings by the fireplace, when they were covered with a warm blanket, immersed in reading and silence. Every day they realized that their love was now their world, their meaning, their everything. They knew that every moment they spent together was the result of their choice, their sacrifice, their strength. Sometimes it seemed to them that no one would ever find them in this new place, that their home will forever remain their secret, their private universe, where no one but themselves has access. From time to time they would hear news about those who remained in the past, but each time it would only bring a slight smile to their faces. They were free, and that freedom now belonged only to them. Several years have passed, and unexpected changes have taken place in their lives. Julia and James began to welcome people into their home: tourists, writers, artists, those who were looking for inspiration and peace. Their house has become more than just a place of solitude. It became a place where people came for healing, and they began to support them as best they could. Julia and James knew that their path was unusual, but it allowed them to better understand those who were suffering, who were looking for their place, who needed support. Their lives have found an amazing balance. They were happy together, and at the same time their home became a place for others who needed peace. In this new place, far from everything that once seemed important, they found their true calling. The house on the hill, Julia and James' cozy hideout, eventually turned into a place of attraction for people looking for peace, meaning, or just a short refuge from their own fears. Each new guest brought with them a special atmosphere and left a piece of himself in their house. Julia and James have learned to find joy in these fleeting encounters. Their guests were mostly strangers, but with each new face, each new story, they were strengthened in the idea that they no longer had to hide. It had been several years since they had left their past behind, and Julia increasingly noticed that time spent away from everyone she knew had changed her. In the past, she had her own circle of friends, familiar places, and a simple, understandable life, but now she was surrounded by strangers, waves, and silence. It was this silence, which had once been frightening, that now became a source of comfort to her. She even found a special beauty in it, like in old letters or half-forgotten memories. However, the peace they were finding turned out to be illusory. One late evening, when a storm was raging outside the windows, there was a knock at their door. Julia, not expecting anyone, was surprised, but she opened the door and saw a figure that gave her a strange feeling, as if a ghost from the past stood in front of her. He was an old acquaintance connected with her former life, a man from whom she did not expect to hear at least something about herself. He came with news that woke up an old pain. It seemed as if her whole former life had suddenly come closer, reminding her of what she had tried so hard to forget. Old friends, relatives, whom Julia had not seen for a long time, conveyed their emotions, their disappointment and bitterness to this person. Someone else's condemnation, which had once caused her so much pain, now sounded like a distant echo, but she felt her heart begin to ache again. She was overtaken by the realization that her past would never completely leave her. The words conveyed by this man revived old doubts in her. She remembered her children who refused to accept her choice, and this memory tormented her. Julia couldn't sleep that night. She recalled the years when her family was the center of her world, when she gave all of herself to her children and home. Her eldest son, her daughters, they all turned away from her, not realizing that a real revolution had happened in her heart. During the long years she had been away from them, she had come to terms with the idea that their relationship would not be the same, but now all her wounds had reopened. She wondered if her happiness was worth going through all this way, through all the losses, through all the broken connections. Her love for James remained unchanged, but that night she couldn't shake the feeling of loss. The next day, when the storm subsided, Julia went to the ocean. She walked on the wet sand, feeling the water touching her feet, and felt the inner storm gradually subside. It seemed to her that the ocean was absorbing her pain, her fears and doubts. Looking at the vast expanses of water, she began to realize that the time spent trying to forget something or get away from something was in vain. Her past will always be with her, as an integral part of herself. But that doesn't stop her from continuing on her way. Returning home, Julia felt that something important had happened to her. Now her past has ceased to be a threat, it has become the basis for a new awareness. She accepted her mistakes and the bitterness of her losses, realizing that all this only strengthened her. James met her on the doorstep, and when she looked into his eyes, she realized that they had both found peace. Their love withstood the test of time and suffering, and a new life was for them a well-deserved reward for the path they had traveled. After this inner transformation, their lives gained new depth and maturity. They were no longer afraid of the shadow of the past and managed to find solace and inspiration in what they had experienced. Julia and James did not look like a typical couple. Their lives were different from the lives of those around them, but their union became stronger, and they found meaning in every moment they spent together. Their love was like the sea, changeable, deep and eternal. There were even more guests in their house. People, in search of inner peace and solitude, found solace in their stories. They, without realizing it, became a kind of guides for those who were looking for answers to questions about themselves, about life and about love. And although they did not share their personal story, its echoes were heard in their every act, in every comforting word spoken for their guests. Julia and James became like guardians of the inner world of those who needed peace and inspiration. Their house has become a symbol not only of love, but also of forgiveness, acceptance and inner liberation. Julia and James began to see something more in their lives than just their union. They saw that they could help others, that their path could become a source of strength and inspiration for those who had gone through suffering and internal contradictions. Their story didn't need words, it was written in their eyes, in their touches, and in the looks they exchanged as they passed each other. Over the years, their home has become a place of attraction for people looking not only for peace, but also for answers to their questions. There was an atmosphere of acceptance in this house. There was no condemnation or prejudice. The guests came and went, and each time Julia and James felt that their own lives were taking on a deeper meaning. Their union, which had endured so much pain, turned into something more. It became a quiet haven for those who got lost on their way. Years passed, and their house continued to live, filled with the stories and lives of those who had been here. Time seemed to slow down, giving them the peace and happiness they had been seeking for so long. Now they understood that their love had taken on a new form. It had ceased to be just their personal feeling and had become a symbol of acceptance and strength for others. Their story, full of loss and pain, made sense when they realized that even the most difficult trials can lead to something bright. Now their days flowed steadily and calmly. They no longer worried about the past or made plans for the future. They lived in the present, realizing that every moment is their precious treasure, that every day is part of their path, which was more important to them than any achievements. Their love became that quiet but powerful source of light that illuminated their home and the hearts of those who came there. Decades have passed, and this house on the hill has become a symbol not only of love and peace, but also of life itself in all its manifestations. Julia and James, who stepped over their fears and doubts, created their own world, which became their best legacy. And when the day comes when their story will remain only in memories, their home and their love will continue to live, as a reminder that true acceptance and love are able to overcome any obstacles and keep the light in the most difficult trials. With the onset of a warm summer evening, James, tired of sleepless nights and anxious thoughts, stood at the exit from the station, looking around for familiar streets and squares. The city that had seemed cozy to him before now looked like a gloomy maze, but he knew exactly why he was here. Julia had disappeared, and he had the feeling that every day he spent without her seemed to be draining the life out of him. He needed to find her, to explain everything that had accumulated in his heart. After walking through several narrow streets, he suddenly found himself in front of the library, an old building with large windows that seemed to see him everywhere. It flashed through his mind that if she was still here, she would definitely come here, to one of the few places where she could find solitude. James went inside, inhaled the familiar smell of dust and old books, looking around. But to his disappointment, the library turned out to be empty. He took a book from the shelf and sat at a table by the window, staring at the page, but the words before his eyes seemed meaningless. A few minutes later, he heard light footsteps and felt his heart stop. Julia was standing in the doorway. She didn't notice him, lost in her own thoughts, and headed for the bookshelves. Her fingers ran over the spines and he couldn't keep quiet anymore.
You're back after all. I knew you were here.
Julia started in surprise, but when she saw James, she froze. Surprise mixed with mild annoyance showed on her face.
James, what are you doing here?
I came to find you. You left without saying a word. Do you think I could just let you go after everything that happened between us?
She looked down, trying to find the right words, but her voice sounded muffled and strained.
I shouldn't have left? James, it's not that simple. I tried to leave so that you could live your life without these strange feelings, without me.
Do you really think you can run away from yourself? From us? Julia, you don't understand. I can't live normally knowing that I've lost you. Not after everything we've done. What I feel.
You're wrong, James. It's temporary, that's all. It will pass. We just got too attached to each other. It just takes time for everything to fall back into place.
Body affection? Do you really think it's just affection? Julia, every time I close my eyes, I see you, I hear your voice. It's like we're connected by something that can't be explained.
Julia took a deep breath, trying not to give in to his words. She knew that this feeling was too dangerous, that it would destroy them both if given free rein.
James, you have to understand. I want you to find your happiness, not hide behind this one. An illusion that we both made up.
An illusion? Do you call this an illusion? Julia, is it possible to ignore what is happening inside us? Tell me honestly, don't you feel it? Don't you feel it? Don't you understand that it's not easy?
She lowered her head, hiding her eyes, but her voice became more firm.
No, James. This is a mistake. I'm your mother, and we can't let these feelings control us.
James took a step toward her, his eyes burning with a mixture of anger and pain.
You know, I tried to forget you, I tried to move on, as you say. But every day it felt like my heart was being ripped out. You can run, you can hide, but you won't get away from yourself. And I'm not going to leave until you admit the truth.
What's the truth, James? Do you want to hear that I have these feelings too? That every moment spent away from you becomes torture? Okay, I'll admit it. But it doesn't change anything. We can't be together the way you want.
Her voice was trembling, but she tried to hold on, not to give way to the tears that were coming to her eyes.
You say it doesn't change anything, but look at yourself. You're in as much pain as I am. Why should we pretend? For what? For the sake of some norms that others have come up with.
Because these norms protect us from destruction. Because if we violate these boundaries, we will be torn to pieces. Can't you see that this is going to lead us to disaster?
Maybe you're right, maybe this will really destroy us. But I can't just live like that, knowing that you're somewhere far away, that you're suffering. This is not life, Julia. It's torture.
He took a step forward and took her hand. She didn't pull it away, but her gaze spoke of a deep inner conflict.
James, you're asking me the impossible. How can I give up my role as a mother? How can I forget about it?
You will never be just a mother to me. You are my world, my everything. I'm not asking you to reject it, but I'm asking you to stop being afraid of how we feel. Even if we have to hide, I'm willing to do it as long as you're around.
Hiding. Hide your feelings from everyone and live in constant fear? This is not life, James. This is even worse than torture. I don't want you to live your life like this.
And if I say that I'm ready for this for you, that I don't care what others think, that it's only what we feel that matters.
She slowly withdrew her hand, looked away, as if avoiding his eyes.
You're saying this now because you don't understand what it really means. I don't want you to ruin your life for me.
Or maybe this is exactly what I need to feel alive. Do you think I can just forget you? Start over? Don't you understand that I don't need this, that I won't be able to leave?
He took another step forward. There was no distance left between them.
Julia, I love you. You can reject it, you can hide, but I won't back down.
She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting pain and disappointment.
Do you love me? James, this is not love, it's just confusing feelings that arose because we are too close. True love does not bring pain, it does not torment.
Then why am I suffering without you? Why do I feel like I've lost a part of myself when you're not around? It's not just affection, Julia. It's bigger.
Do you really believe that? Do you believe that we can live hiding from the whole world, hiding our feelings?
Yes, I do. If you're with me, I'm ready to do anything.
Her eyes filled with tears, but she tried not to show her emotions.
James, you don't understand. I love you too, but it doesn't change anything. This is not the kind of love that should be between us. This is wrong.
Wrong for whom? For other people? Why should I care about the opinions of those who don't understand what I'm going through?
She was silent. Her gaze was full of despair and fear, but she couldn't pretend anymore.
I do not know, James. I do not know what to do. Simply, just give me some time.
No matter how long you need, I'll wait. But I'm not leaving, Julia. I can't leave you alone with this.
For a moment, their hands met again, and they stood surrounded by silence that seemed to fill the entire library. Evening came, and grey twilight began to thicken over the old library, hiding it behind a thin veil of darkness. There were occasional silhouettes of passers-by hurrying about their business outside the windows, but James could see no one and nothing but the light slipping between the shelves of books. Julia was there, and her presence was felt in everything in the air, in the soft rustle of the pages, even in the barely noticeable creak of the old wooden floor. They were in different corners of the room, but their gazes constantly crossed, piercing each other with silent questions to which they had no answers. Finally, unable to stand it, James got up and walked over to Julia. She noticed his movement but did not try to leave, just sighed and put the book on the shelf, as if pushing it aside, just as she tried to push his feelings away from her.
You're still reading in this library, as if you can find all the answers here. But you know, Julia, I don't believe you're running here for books.
Julia turned to him, her face remained calm, but her gaze betrayed the inner conflict tearing her apart.
And if so, what do you want to hear, James? Why am I hiding here from you?
Maybe not from me, but from myself. Do you think it's possible to hide from these feelings, like hiding a book on a shelf?
I think you're being dramatic. It's just a library. Just a place to be alone and think.
Alone? And you call that being alone? As if you don't know that I'm coming for you. It's like you don't feel like I'm around anyway.
She tried to take a step to the side, but he gently stopped her by touching her arm. Julia looked at his fingers as if she had never seen them before, and froze.
You don't understand me, James. I didn't come here to look or hide. I just want you to leave me alone, at least for a while.
Alone? So you still consider me your enemy? Or am I just an uncomfortable reminder that you want to forget?
Her eyes glittered, and she hurried to look away so that he would not see this weakness. You don't understand. Everything is much more complicated than it seems. If you knew what I had to go through to decide to do this, you wouldn't say such words.
Is it more difficult? Julia, I want to understand. I want you to tell me how you really feel. Without masks, without this far-fetched calm that you wear like a shield.
She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and exhaled slowly, as if preparing to confess something important that even she was afraid of.
Do you want the truth, James? Good. The truth is, every time you're around, I find it hard to breathe. I can feel this one. This connection that draws us to each other, but...
But what? Why can't you let yourself feel that? Why, Julia? Are you so afraid to admit it even to yourself?
Afraid? Do you think I'm scared? I'm terrified. Because I know what it can lead to. James, this connection, it's wrong. You have to find someone who will love you the way you deserve, not.
Not what? Not how I love you. Are you saying that I have to give up my feelings just because you're scared? That I should live as if nothing had happened?
Yes. That's exactly what I want to say. Because this is our only chance. I can't afford to think that these feelings have a right to exist.
He took a step closer, his face became serious, and his eyes looked straight into her soul.
But why? Why should we deny them as if it were some kind of crime? Tell me the truth, Julia. You feel the same way I do. You know I'm right.
She fell silent, her shoulders sagged, and for a moment it seemed to her that she could no longer fight the storm that was inside her.
Yes, James. I feel the same way. And that's why I have to leave. Because if I stay, it will destroy both of us.
Do you really think that something so strong can destroy us? We're already ruined when we're not together. Isn't that worse than what we might lose?
Her eyes met his again, but now there were tears in them that she could no longer hold back.
You don't understand. If we give free rein to these feelings, we will become strangers. People won't understand. They'll turn away. I'm not afraid for myself. I'm afraid for you.
I'm not afraid. Let them turn away. Let them not understand. I don't care what anyone else thinks. The only thing that matters is you and how we feel.
Do you think it's so easy to cross out everything that connected us before? You don't understand, James. I won't be able to see you and not feel like I'm betraying my own nature.
He looked at her with pain and determination, not going to back down.
Are you betraying me? Do you think you're betraying your nature by loving me? And if I say that betrayal for me is pretending that these feelings don't exist?
She was confused, her hands were shaking, and she had difficulty keeping her voice from trembling.
You don't understand. Love is not only what we feel. This is what we are losing. It's the destruction of what makes us who we are.
What if I say I don't want to be the one who lives by these rules? That I'm willing to break anything in order to be with you?
She took a step back, her face looking painfully serious.
You don't see what you're saying, James. These are just words. When you face reality, you will realize that these words mean nothing. You're just confused.
Confused? No, you're confused, Julia. You hide behind fears, behind social norms that have nothing to do with what the heart feels.
Her eyes were glistening with tears, but she continued to stare at him.
I'm afraid. I'm afraid that if we go along with these feelings, we'll lose everything we had, everything that makes us close.
You're afraid of losing what you've already lost. Because when you left, I lost you, Julia. And I'm not going to lose you again.
She turned to the window, looking out at the street, as if trying to find answers somewhere behind the glass.
I tried to leave to save us. And you came here to destroy everything I was trying to protect.
Protect? Protect from whom, Julia? From me? Or from myself?
Her shoulders shook, and she finally turned to him, her voice barely audible, but it contained all the pain she had stored inside.
I'm afraid of myself, James. I'm afraid of what these feelings can do to me. I always thought I knew what love was, but now I'm not sure about anything.
I'm not sure either, but I know one thing: we can't deny how we feel. I'm willing to do anything to be with you, even if it means giving up the past.
She was silent for a long time, her face seemed to reflect all her inner torments. But at that moment she realized that there was something about their relationship that she couldn't deny, despite her fears and doubts.
I do not know if I will ever be able to accept this, but if I don't try, I'll regret it for the rest of my life.
Then let me be there, at least for now, at least for a while.
She nodded, and a silence fell between them, in which all words and fears seemed to dissolve. It was already dark when the two of them left the library and walked slowly through the streets of the city. The silence between them was tense, but surprisingly not oppressive. They both knew that each of them was speaking without words, and that this silence was now enough to get into each other's thoughts. After a few minutes of silent walking, they came to a small cafe on the corner of the street, its warm light beckoning inside. Julia stopped, looking at the neon sign that was swaying in the wind, and without turning around, she said,
Shall we go? I think we need to talk after all. I don't know if it will work, but...
Of course. Only if you don't mind.
They went inside. The cafe was empty except for a lone bartender, who was melancholically wiping glasses and only nodded to them in greeting. James chose a corner by the window, away from the door, so that no one could interrupt their conversation. When they sat down opposite each other, a tense silence hummed between them again. Julia hugged her coffee mug with both hands, as if this warmth could help her cope with what was weighing on her heart.
Why are you afraid to listen to me, Julia? Why do you always shut yourself up? I just want to understand how you feel. What are you so afraid of?
She looked up at him, and there was a mixture of fatigue and despair in her gaze.
I'm afraid that if I start listening, I won't be able to stop. And then what? What will happen to you then? With us?
So what? What will happen to us if we just accept what we feel? Are we going to stop being ourselves?
That's not the point. I can't just turn a blind eye to all the norms, all the principles that I've been teaching myself all my life. I have to be strong, James, for you.
Strong or false? Do you think that's how you're going to save us? I'm not asking you to change. I'm asking you to be honest, at least with yourself. We will not be able to live pretending that there is nothing.
She looked down, and her fingers nervously fiddled with the handle of the mug.
Do you think it's easy for me? James, I struggle with this feeling every day. I know that I won't be able to look other people in the eye, knowing that I've violated their trust. And it won't just be my pain. It will be your destruction.
Destruction? Julia, I'm already collapsing. Every day without you feels like torture. I understand that you're afraid, but do you think I'm not afraid? We both know it's dangerous. But does that make our feelings false?
She closed her eyes, as if trying to hide from his words, but they pulled her like a magnet.
To be together. It's too much of a price. For your sake, for the sake of your future, I have to stop this now before it's too late.
Is it late? Do you think it's not too late? Julia, I've lost my peace. I can't think of anything else but you. And you think it's just going to pass?
Yes, I want to believe that it will pass. Time heals everything, and you just need to distance yourself from me, start building your life.
Are you saying this is temporary? That I'll just get used to living without you? Do you really believe that?
She didn't answer, just looked out the window, where a fine rain was falling behind the glass. Julia knew James was right, but her own fears, doubts, and all the things that held her back wouldn't let go.
I do not know, James. I really don't know what to believe. Everything is messed up in my head, and the more I think about it, the worse it gets.
Then why don't you stop thinking, at least once? Stop analyzing, Julia. Just trust your feelings, not your fear.
She smiled bitterly, covering her mouth with her hand, as if she wanted to contain all the emotions that overwhelmed her.
You're so sure that everything can be solved with one solution. But this is not the case. I won't be able to just say yes or no and start living again.
I'm not asking you for drastic decisions. I'm asking you to stop running. Give yourself time, give yourself the right to feel, even if it's difficult.
What if we're both wrong? If this feeling destroys you? James, I value you too much to watch you burn because of me.
He leaned forward, his voice became soft, but there was determination in it.
Julia, understand I have already chosen. And if I'm going to burn, I'm going to burn for you. I can't just watch you leave without taking a single step towards you.
Her eyes filled with tears again, but she tried to hide them by turning away.
You sound like it's easy. And I don't think I can handle it anymore. I don't want to hurt you, but I can't fight myself either.
So maybe it's time to stop fighting? Julia, I do not know where this will lead us, but I want to go there with you, even if we have to feel our way.
She froze, looking at him. There was a storm raging inside her that she couldn't explain.
But how? How can we live knowing that we are? What is wrong?
And what is right? Can anyone tell us that our feelings are wrong? Or are you afraid of what people will say?
I don't care what others say. I care what your conscience tells you years later. How can you live with this knowledge if suddenly everything turns out to be an illusion?
He looked at her seriously, his face expressing calm confidence.
I am not afraid of this illusion. Because I know this is not an illusion. I am ready to accept anything that comes with these feelings, even if it is pain. But Julia, don't make me live without you by pretending that nothing is happening.
She tried again to find words that could convince him, but realized that she had no arguments.
And if I do decide to leave, will you be able to let me go?
No, I'll keep looking for you, over and over, until you realize that leaving doesn't solve anything. You can try to hide, but we both know it's useless.
Her face became thoughtful. She pulled away, lowering her head. It seemed as if a wall had appeared between them, which they both saw, but no one dared to destroy.
James, this shouldn't have happened. We were supposed to be close, but not in this way.
Do you really think you can change your feelings? What can you just forget?
She smiled sadly, and there was a deep weariness in her eyes.
I can't. And it hurts me because I do not know what will happen next. I don't know if I can handle it.
Then let me help you. Let us go through this together, even if we're scared.
She looked at him again, and this time there was determination in her eyes, mixed with anxiety and despair.
I'll try. But I can't promise that I can stay, James.
I'm not asking for promises. Just be here, be with me, even if it's difficult.
She nodded slowly, and at that moment their eyes met. After that night in the cafe, tense but surprisingly frank, their lives began to seem more complicated than ever. Julia returned home feeling as if her soul had split in two, as if someone had torn out a part of her very heart and left this gap aching, bleeding from the inside. She was sure that her decision to avoid intimacy with James, to suppress her feelings, was the only way to protect them both. But somewhere deep inside, behind the wall of fear and anxiety, there was still a spark of desire to be close, despite everything. From that day on, her daily life was filled with the ghosts of past memories and their meetings flashing through her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, an image of James rose in front of her, his piercing gaze, his confident determination, which sometimes was so close to her that it took her breath away. She understood that in her desire to suppress feelings for him, there was not so much a fear of condemnation from society as anxiety for his future, for his fate. Her feelings were strong, pure and all-consuming, but her heart was torn between an instinctive desire to protect him from the misunderstanding of others and this passionate attachment. With each passing day, Julia felt that her self-deception and attempts to suppress her feelings were becoming more and more unbearable. Every morning when she woke up, she found herself thinking that she missed James. She noticed his absence even in small things. Her usual walks ceased to bring pleasure, and evening readings became only a painful outlet from which she expected something more. The familiar rituals that had previously filled her life with meaning seemed empty. It seemed that her whole being resisted this lie, which she tried to convince herself, as if the denied love was the beginning of her new existence. James also felt a change in himself. He spent his days immersed in books and research, but thoughts of Julia did not leave him for a moment. It seemed to him that he saw her everywhere, in people passing by, in the gazes of random passers-by, in the shadows of old trees. Every minute spent away from her was filled with agonizing anticipation, but for what? He didn't know himself. However, one thing was clear: their bond did not disappear or weaken, but on the contrary became stronger, gradually filling his heart. Each new attempt by James to shift his attention to everyday affairs, to get himself involved in something else, failed. He was coming to realize that his love for Julia was not just a random whim or a temporary infatuation. It was a bond that seemed to him ancient and stronger than anything he knew. It was as if his soul had found something native and unconditional in her soul, as if they were made for each other, but it all remained unbearably complicated. James knew he couldn't live by giving up on her, pretending those feelings didn't exist. Several weeks have passed, filled with loneliness, thoughts, and inner struggle. Julia carefully avoided places where she could meet James, tried her best to return to her old life, to her usual calm. But every time she passed by the places that connected her to him, her heart was filled with a strange, painful longing. She felt herself slowly but steadily losing her balance, and this loss brought her not only pain, but also a kind of strange satisfaction. Deep down, she was aware of her feelings for James would not go away, no matter how hard she tried to suppress them. On the contrary, her flight only intensified this attraction. James, for his part, was also going through a difficult period. On the one hand, he tried to give Julia space, knowing that her heart was also bursting with doubts. On the other hand, it seemed to him that every new day without her was becoming more and more painful for him. At some point, he decided that he could no longer bear this distance, which burned him from the inside out. James tried to find solace in art and began to paint, but his paintings, filled with dark shades and deep shadows, only reflected his longing for her. As the autumn cold approached, Julia began to realize that her flight was only exacerbating her pain. At the moment when the first snow began to fall on the streets of the city, she stopped and realized that it was pointless to hide any further. Her heart had already made a choice, even if her mind was desperately resisting. She knew that eventually she would not be able to live without James, that she felt alive in his presence. For the first time in a long time, she decided to admit to herself that there was nowhere else to run. Their feelings had become a part of her new self, and she could no longer give them up. Deciding to meet James, she wrote him a short letter, inviting him to a meeting in the old park where they used to often walk. This place was quiet, hidden from prying eyes, and reminded her of the days when their connection was not yet realized, when they were just friends. Now the park seemed to her as a symbol, as a portal to their common, hidden world, where they could be themselves. When they met, Julia felt something break inside her. Her heart began to pound wildly at every step he took, at every glance he cast at her. She noticed that he had changed too, his face had become more serious, and there was a deep longing in his eyes. She understood that he too had gone through painful days and nights, through doubts and pain, and at that moment they both realized that their feelings were stronger than any fears and obstacles. Autumn turned into winter, and every day their meetings became more and more inevitable. They were careful not to draw attention to themselves, but every new evening spent together strengthened their bond. They walked through the snow-covered streets together, sat in cafes for a long time, talked about books, about their lives, about dreams. Their conversations touched on the simplest things, but everything in these meetings made deep sense, as if every step they took was part of a complex and beautiful dance that only the two of them could understand. Julia began to realize that, despite all the danger and fear, she could not give up this love. Her soul and her heart belonged to James, and with each passing day it became more obvious. She felt her inner doubts gradually dissolve, leaving room for something new, for something stronger than pain and fear. She realized that their bond could not be destroyed either by society or by her own fears. Too much had already happened. They had both suffered too deep wounds to just turn away and sever this connection. With each new evening, James also realized more and more that this was not just an attachment or a temporary infatuation. It was a real, deep love, which, despite its complexity, brought him true satisfaction and a sense of peace. His world was empty without Julia, and every day without her seemed meaningless. Now that they were together, even in secret, he knew that he would not trade this connection for anything. Winter was coming to an end, and with the first signs of spring, Julia and James realized that their feelings had strengthened so much that they no longer needed to hide. They decided not just to accept their connection, but to make it a part of their lives, despite the possible consequences. Julia knew that there were many difficulties ahead of them, but it became clear to her that without James her existence would be incomplete, and now she was not ready to give up on him, no matter how difficult it was for them. Their meetings in the old park became for them not just walks, but a ritual, a time when they could be themselves, speak openly and honestly. Julia began to realize that their bond was not just love, but something more. It was her new self. She felt that their life could be difficult, but despite this, she was ready to go this way, because now she knew that true love always requires sacrifices, and this is the only thing worth living for. And now, accepting spring, their hearts were ready for any challenges. When Julia and James openly accepted their feelings, their lives took on a new dimension, becoming more fulfilling and meaningful. However, with this acceptance came new fears. They both understood that their bond went beyond the norms and expectations they were used to following. Acknowledging their feelings was not only a release, but also a challenge to everything they knew about life. Now they had to face the opinion of society, with condemnation and the possibility of losing everything that was important to them. Julia tried to continue living as before, but it was getting harder. Previously, her every day was built around familiar things, meetings and people with whom she shared her life. But now, every conversation, every mention of a relationship or family made her nervous. She felt that something had changed in her gaze, in her gestures, and it seemed to her that others were aware of her inner conflict. She was tormented by the thought that at one moment the truth might come out and ruin her life. At first, Julia tried to drive away her fears, convincing herself that their relationship was something so personal and hidden that no one would guess. But her anxiety grew every day, turning into anxiety that poisoned all the joys of their relationship. Casual glances from acquaintances, unpredictable conversations with friends, everything caused her to panic. She understood that their relationship could become known at any moment, and this fear, like a bitter shadow, hung over every day. James, in turn, was also beginning to feel the tension building. He saw Julia becoming more and more withdrawn as her mood became depressed, and felt that her worries were gradually moving her away from him. He tried to support her, to make her feel safe with him, but it was becoming increasingly difficult for him to cope with the pressure. He knew that their feelings were too strong to simply ignore or deny them, but he also understood that Julia's fear was justified. Each new meeting with him brought Julia not only joy, but also painful experiences. Her love for James was real and deep, but it was becoming more of a burden to her every day. Julia saw that her life was turning into a struggle between her feelings and the realization that their relationship could never be accepted by others. She became withdrawn, tried not to discuss her fears with him, but this only made the situation worse. It seemed to her that if she left, she would save them both from suffering, but at the very thought of parting, her heart broke. One evening, after a particularly hard day, Julia realized that her strength was running out. She was exhausted, mentally and physically exhausted, as if her soul was tired of this endless confrontation. At that moment, she firmly decided that maybe leaving was the only way out. At first, she even felt relieved when she considered her decision, but the more she delved into the thoughts of the breakup, the more doubts arose in her soul. Julia understood perfectly well that leaving would mean the final rejection of happiness. She imagined a life without James and felt the emptiness wash over her in a wave of despair. She knew she couldn't completely forget him, that these feelings would stay with her forever, but they would bring her nothing but pain if she tried to suppress them. The internal contradiction became a real torture for her. On the one hand, she wanted to be with him, on the other, she understood that this could destroy them both. As night fell, Julia gathered her thoughts and made the final decision to leave. She left James a short note, saying that she was going away for a while to find peace and think. Deep down, she knew that this was not just a trip, but an attempt to break out of this vicious circle of pain and doubt. The next morning, when dawn was just beginning to light up the city, she quietly left their house and went into the unknown, hoping that the distance would help her cope with her love for James. The first days away from him were a blur. She felt free from his presence, but this feeling did not bring joy. On the contrary, it seemed to her that her heart was now completely empty. She wandered the streets where no one knew her, where she could just be another stranger hiding from her past. But every evening, a sharp sense of loss filled her soul. She tried to convince herself that this was only a temporary weakness, but every day her inner conflict became more painful. A few weeks passed, and Julia began to realize that her escape had not solved anything. On the contrary, the feeling for James became even stronger. Every day away from him only increased her longing. She realized that she would not be able to find peace away from him, because her heart now belonged to him forever. She tried to distract herself by doing her daily chores, spending her days alone, but it all seemed pointless. She realized that even if they couldn't be together, her love for him would stay with her forever. James felt that he had lost her. He tried to find her, but all his attempts were unsuccessful. He knew that Julia was probably gone forever, and the thought tore at his heart. It seemed to him that he had lost not only her, but also a part of himself. Deep down, he knew that he would never be able to truly forget her, that his life would now be filled with an emptiness that nothing could fill. The days passed slowly, and each new day without Julia was a real test for James. He became more and more withdrawn, his interest in everyday affairs disappeared, and life began to seem meaningless to him. He understood that their separation was the result of her fears and doubts, but he couldn't shake the feeling that their bond was too strong to just break it off. A few more weeks passed, and one morning Julia realized that she could no longer run away from her feelings. She realized that her love for James was not just an accident, but part of her destiny, that their relationship was predetermined by life itself. She decided to return to him, even if it meant that they would have to face condemnation and pain. Her fears remained, but now she was ready to accept them in order to be with him. When she returned to the city, she met James, and in his eyes she saw the same longing and pain that she felt herself. Their meeting was silent, but their gaze reflected everything that they had passed far from each other. They realized that their bond had become stronger, that now they could not give up on each other. Julia made the decision to stay with him, despite her fears. Her love for James became the meaning of her life for her, and she was ready to go through any trials just not to lose this feeling. So, after going through suffering and separation, they realized that their love is stronger than any obstacles. Now their future seemed unknown and dangerous to them, but each of them knew that they could not live without the other. Julia and James returned to life together cautiously, as if treading on thin ice, afraid to take a step that would bring down their world again. However, despite her fears and forebodings, every moment with James seemed to Julia filled with joy and true meaning. With her return to the city, their bond seemed to take on a second wind. The old heaviness dissolved, giving way to sensations from which both of them could no longer escape. Julia continued to face the same worries. She was afraid that others would someday find out about her feelings for James, condemn her, reject her. She couldn't forget how she had spent years building her life, according to generally accepted norms, following the expectations of others, and now she didn't know if she could cope with the possible consequences. Her affection for James seemed dangerous, like an open wound that she had to hide. But no matter what she did, her heart belonged to him. It was inevitable, like breathing. James was ready to do anything for her, and every day their meetings became a source of strength and inspiration for him. He could no longer imagine his life without Julia. His love for her had outgrown the boundaries of ordinary affection, turning into a deep, almost spiritual feeling. She was his support, his inspiration, and he saw in her a reflection of his soul. Their connection became the basis of his existence, and he understood that without it his life would be meaningless. They both tried to avoid crowded places, meetings with friends and acquaintances who could see something more in their relationship. They knew they couldn't hide from prying eyes forever, but in these first weeks of being together, it was enough for them to know that they were together. They enjoyed every moment, every look they shared in silence, knowing that it was the only thing that mattered. Their lives were filled with simple joys. They walked around the neighborhood, wandered for hours through fields and forests, where they could be alone with themselves and with each other, where there were no judgmental views or preconceived opinions. With the arrival of spring, their bond became even deeper. Warm days, blooming trees, fresh air, all this seemed to symbolize a new stage, a new beginning for them. Julia began to worry less about the future, to pay less attention to fears and anxieties. She began to realize that their love was not a mistake or a whim, but something deeper and more significant. Her heart gradually found peace next to him, and this gave her the strength to fight against inner fears and doubts. Over time, Julia began to notice that her life had changed not only because of their relationship, but also because she began to feel real for the first time. Her desire to follow established norms, her fear of other people's views, her constant doubts, all this gradually receded. Now that she has realized and accepted her feelings for James, her inner world has become more holistic and harmonious. She no longer felt torn between duty and feelings. Her heart was at peace with itself, and this feeling of peace and fullness inspired her more and more every day. James, seeing her gradually overcome her fears, felt deeply grateful. He understood how much strength and courage it takes to accept such feelings, and was ready to support her in everything. He felt that their love not only filled his life with meaning, but also helped him grow, become more empathetic and confident. It seemed to him that he had found not only a lover, but also a kindred spirit who understood him more deeply than anyone else. However, despite all this, the shadows of the past sometimes returned, forcing Julia to think about the future again. She was still afraid that their relationship might one day become public. Sometimes she saw people who knew her and James looking at them with interest, and her heart sank with fear. She realized that they couldn't live in the shadows forever, that one day their feelings might become visible to everyone. And in those moments she had to overcome her fears over and over again in order not to deviate from her decision. Spring turned to summer, and warm days became a time of deep confessions and revelations for them. Julia understood that their relationship had become the meaning of her life for her, that her heart and soul belonged to James completely. She felt that she could no longer live without him, and this love became for her the very essence, a part of herself. She was no longer afraid of her feelings, but she still felt anxious about the condemnation they might have to face. James, in turn, decided to fight for their love, despite all the difficulties. He knew that trials awaited them, but he also realized that his love for Julia gave him the strength to cope with any obstacles. He was willing to make any sacrifice for her, and for the sake of their bond. His determination strengthened Julia, and every time she began to doubt, his support and care gave her the strength to move on. One sunny summer evening, sitting together by the window, they realized that their lives were now inextricably linked, that their feelings had withstood all the tests and become even stronger. They understood that now they had no way back, that their love was more than just a fleeting feeling. She became their choice, their meaning, their destiny, and although they knew that the path ahead would be difficult, their hearts were full of determination. In the end, they found each other amid all the obstacles and trials, and now they were ready to accept their love for what it was with its difficulties and beauty. Julia and James decided not to hide anymore. They decided to open up to the world, so that they would no longer feel trapped in the shadow of fear. Their love no longer needed the approval of others, because they found real happiness and meaning in it. Their feelings had become a source of strength for them, and now they were ready to face any challenge, knowing that their bond would withstand everything. Time passed, and Julia realized that her life was filled with light and warmth. She was aware that their journey had not been easy, but every step was worth it to be here, next to James. She no longer felt lonely and lost. Now she had a man with whom she could share everything. Their love became something eternal for her, something that no longer succumbed to any external forces.